Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we are going to deal with 1 Samuel 25, a story in which a man named Nabal and his wife Abigail engage with David with opposite consequences. The narrative sets the stage by informing us that the great prophet Samuel had just died. That's in verse 1. This was a consequential prophet whose death prompted all Israel congregating to mourn his passing. Subsequently, Samuel was buried in Ramah. Of course, Samuel had anointed David to succeed Saul much earlier. That's a story told in 1 Samuel 16. However, David was not yet king since Saul was still very much alive. David had been on the lam for some time, mostly to avoid Saul's wrath. While on the run, David had gathered a number of people who were in distress, in debt, and who were generally discontented. David became the captain of this motley crew. That's a story that is told in 1 Samuel 22, especially the first 2 verses. In a sense, David had become a sort of Robin Hood. We need to keep this in mind as we learn in the current story that David and his group had just gone to the wilderness of Paran. This seems to be a geographical error in that this wilderness was in the extreme south, far from the location in which the story in 1 Samuel 25 occurs. In any case, we are immediately introduced to 2 characters who will be significant in this narrative. The first character to be introduced happens to be a very wealthy man. He possessed 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, a considerable amount of wealth. At the time, he was shearing his flocks in Carmel, even though his residence was in Maon. That's in verse 2 of chapter 25. This man's name was Nabal. Quite obviously, this name was generated for this episode. The name means fool. Presumably, no parents would curse their own child with such a horrible name. Whether the character fits his name remains to be seen. His wife's name was Abigail, a much better name. Her name means, "My father is joy," perhaps even "my divine father is joy." Then we are given more than names, but also descriptions. Abigail was intelligent and beautiful. On the other hand, Nabal was churlish and difficult. Indeed, he was a Calebite, an ethnic slur of some kind that suggests acting like a dog. That's in verse 3. After these introductions and descriptions, we are told that David had just heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. That's in verse 4. At that point, David sent 10 of his men to go and find Nabal. They were to greet him in David's name. They were to pronounce a benediction on the man by saying, "Peace to you, peace to your house, and peace to be to all that you have." That's in verse 6. Furthermore, the men are to remind Nabal that even though their shepherds had been around for a while, they were never harmed, and none of their livestock was taken. That's in verse 7. The implication seems to be that David's men could have harassed the shepherds or have taken sheep, or both, had they wanted. David then tells his men that they hope to find favor in Nabal's eyes. Since it happened to be a feast day, David wanted a donation. Specifically, David wanted his men to ask, quote, "whatever you have on hand," end of quote, to your servants. That is, the men doing the asking, and David, the captain who had sent them. That's something that they were to ask for. That's in verse 8. Whether this was a friendly gesture or a thinly veiled threat of extortion is in the eye of the reader. Regardless, when the men arrived at where Nabal was, the man's response was all but predictable. Though the men spoke on David's behalf, Nabal's response was, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse?" One of two conclusions may be drawn by Nabal's dual question. Either David's men said that they were representing David ben Jesse, that is, David, the son of Jesse, or David's reputation had preceded him. In the latter case, Nabal knew perfectly well who David was, that he had organized a band of men to run with him, and that his exploits in the territory did not escape anyone's attention. When Nabal continues, he tips his hand that without hesitation or without question, he is fully aware who David was and what his reputation was. Right after feigning ignorance about David's identity, he adds, "There are many servants nowadays who are breaking away from their masters." That's in verse 10. Obviously, that is almost a perfect description of David's gang, which consisted of men in distress, in debt, and who were discontented. Again, think of the first two verses of chapter 22. Nabal is not done with his response, however. He makes abundantly clear that he has no intention of giving anything to these men and the captain they represent. Nabal asks rhetorically, "Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where?" Nabal obviously believed he was being extorted. David's men had suggested that while they were around, Nabal's men and flocks were protected from brigands or bandits. In exchange for that protection, this gang wanted something in return. From Nabal's perspective, this was not protection he either requested or paid for, which meant that he was being threatened outright. Again, whether we sympathize with David's group or Nabal is a matter of perspective. When the disappointed men returned to David and reported what had taken place, David acted immediately. He told his men to strap on their swords. David would not take no for an answer. The sword suggested that he would not the next time ask. This time he would take. So his men strapped on their swords, as did David. This time around it was not 10 men, but a sizable group of 400. Indeed, we are told that 200 remained back taking care of the baggage. This was more than a ragtag band. It was a veritable army. That's in verse 13 of chapter 25. As this army was heading for Nabal, one of Nabal's employees spoke to Abigail. He mentioned that her husband had railed at David's messengers. That's in verse 14. He also explained that, as a matter of fact, David's group had indeed protected Nabal's interests. While David's band was around, they treated Nabal's servants well, protected them from any marauders, stole nothing, and formed a wall around them day and night. In short, whether paid for or not, or whether requested or not, the protection afforded by David's gang had been beneficial to Nabal. The man then urged Abigail to do something because he figured that David's band was now on its way to inflict harm on Nabal, which meant that his employees would be caught in the crossfire. The young man also pointed out that Nabal was being completely unreasonable. His mood was such that one could not even speak to him about this dilemma. That's in verses 14 through 17 of chapter 25. Upon hearing this, Abigail took matters into her own hands. She put together a nice gift consisting of 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep that had been prepared for eating, 5 measures of parched grain, and 200 cakes of figs. All this she loaded on asses. This was a substantial present. Then Abigail told her young men to go before her. She planned to be right behind them. As one might expect, she said nothing whatsoever about her plans to her husband Nabal. That's in verses 18 and 19. Before long, she met up with David's men. At this point, the narrator lets us know what David had in mind. He regarded Nabal's response not only as an insult, but as a supreme act of ingratitude. After all, David reasoned, he had protected this man's interests in the wilderness. The man had benefited greatly from the protection provided, and instead of being grateful, Nabal has rewarded David's good with evil. Because of this, David had vowed to kill Nabal's men. Almost surely, Nabal would be a target as well. That's in verses 21 and 22 of chapter 25. Would Abigail's ploy work? Could David be dissuaded from attacking Nabal and those who worked for him? Would Abigail's present be sufficient to mollify an angry David? Would something else be required to save the situation? If Nabal knew David and his reputation, did Abigail know this information also? What did she think about David and his band? In the next podcast, we will answer those questions because the story continues and provides its own answers. Just to let my listeners know, after part 1 of the story featuring Nabal, Abigail, and David, we will take a break during Thanksgiving week. You will need to tune in on November 28th to hear the conclusion of this fascinating story. In the meantime, enjoy your Thanksgiving holiday. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com, and let me know what your email is. We'll soon be getting ready for our offering our courses. Also, if you have a question you would like me to answer in a Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do 2 simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.